Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll ask you to find a seat, and we'll go ahead and get started. We've got 90 minutes for tonight's program, so there's a lot to cover, so we'll try to be efficient with it, but I'd like to thank you sincerely for attending this evening's program. My name is Evan Blue. I am the Executive Director of the International Relations Council. I know many of you know us well. Those of you who do not know, we are a nonprofit organization based here in Kansas City. We've been in existence since 1955. It's our 70th anniversary as a council, and our main mission is to hold conversations, increase civil discourse, connect with each other in a face-to-face way when so much of the news and media that we consume is through our phone these days. So you attending in this room, being a part of it, building community is incredibly important, particularly in this day and age. If you need to use the restroom at all this evening, if you head out the door, the men's will be to the left and around the corner, women's will be to the right and around the corner. If something going on with the sink in the men's room that says don't use, there's a kitchenette right around the corner, so feel free to use that thing. We have some beer and wine and water here in the corner. You probably noticed a note card on your chair this evening. The way that we're going to do Q&A is if you have a question that you would like to have asked during that portion, which will be about the last 30 minutes of the program, please just write that on your note card. We will get to as many questions as time allows. And when you have that question ready to go, just kind of hold it up like this, and myself or my coworker Dan or Stephen here in the back will be happy to get that from you. So without further ado, actually, let me do one last pitch. If you're not a member of the IRC, please consider joining. Our dues are very reasonable. If you become a member, it really helps us put on programs like this. A lot of our programs are free and low cost, and the way that we can do that is through the support of our members. So please consider that if you're able. There's a QR code at that table. You can scan that. Otherwise, visit our website, irckc.org, and you can sign up there. So thank you so much. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for this evening. We'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. Frank Klimas is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Joint Interagency and Multinational Operations at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Retired Colonel Klimas served as an Air Force Foreign Affairs Officer for the Middle East, North Africa, and also commander the 505th Command and Control Wing Detachment 1 at Fort Leavenworth. Frank, thank you so much for being here this evening. Please take it away.
Thanks, Evan. That was my stealth. Sneaking in. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's program by the International Relations Council on the Gaza Catastrophe. What next for Israel and Palestine? And so I have the privilege of introducing tonight's guest speaker. Khaled Elgindy is a visiting scholar and adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He is the author of the 2019 book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump. Elgindy previously served as director of Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Palestine-Israeli affairs from January 2020 until January of 2025. And honestly, these are great institutions. I've taken many classes on the Middle East at Georgetown. Additionally, I've relied heavily on MEI's podcasts and other publications as well. So you bring great student cred. I know that you are embarrassed by your accomplishments, but you've done great things, sir. From 2010 through 2018, he served as a resident scholar in the foreign policy program at Brookings. Prior to arriving at Brookings, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership at Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009, and was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 and 8. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that besides being a published author, he does contribute to many media and outlets as well as a guest and a contributor. So tonight should be absolutely fantastic. Khaled will provide his perspective on this very complex issue. Now, this is day 579 of the Israeli-Hamas war. That started on October 7th, 2023. Tens of thousands have died in this conflict that takes place in a very, very small area. But it seems like there's no end in sight for the widening conflict that extends throughout the Middle East, from Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iran, and all the way to college campuses here in the United States. And so, to pull apart some of the factors that are behind this conflict and maybe where it's leading, I'd like to bring Khaled Elgindy to the podium to deliver his remarks. Thank you, Khaled.
Thank you for that gracious introduction, and thank you to the IRC for inviting me. I'm going to take just a second. I don't know if this is...
Should be, yes. There you go.
There it is. All right, so now I just need my notes. All right. Sorry, I'm just trying to make the font bigger so I don't have to wear my glasses. Okay. All right. So a couple caveats before I start. One is that what I have to say is not going to be terribly uplifting, so I'm going to apologize in advance. But it is the reality, and this is what's happening. So it is a pretty grim picture that I'll be painting, but it's real, and so it's important. The second is a lot of what I have to say may be upsetting to some people, and I think I'm not going to apologize for that, but I think it's important for me and frankly for everyone to speak hard truths. And so that's the approach that I'm coming at this with. So I'm going to start with an overview of October 7th and then everything that's happened since, not everything, but try to give an overview. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, a lot of numbers, and I hope I do it in a way that will make some sense of the madness that is going on. So as you, I think, all know, October 7th, the attack on October 7th was the deadliest day in Israel's history. 1,200 people approximately were killed by Hamas and other armed groups, as well as individuals who sort of poured into the border, across the border into Israel. It was undoubtedly, I think, one of the greatest atrocities that Hamas has ever committed. Hamas has a long history of attacking both military and civilian targets, but October 7th was particularly egregious, I think, in its scale. It was quite audacious. We can talk about, if people want, I get asked, what was Hamas thinking, how did they, and that's a separate discussion. I'm happy to share my thoughts on that, but obviously I'm not privy to internal thinking. But in any case, this is a day, obviously, that was quite significant in Israel's history. Just sort of, in addition to the 1,200 people who were killed, 251 Israelis were taken captive. So that added a level of trauma to what was already happening. Since then, most of the hostages have been returned, including the ones who tragically were deceased. 192 so far, so there's about 59 or so remaining, and it's unclear exactly how many are still alive, but probably at least 35 or so. That was, just to kind of put that day in perspective, this is what the situation, this is the 15 years before October 7th. The total number of Israelis killed in 15 years in political violence, I don't mean like car accidents or murders, right, but political violence with Palestinians, 310 Israelis were killed. Roughly half of them soldiers in the various Gaza conflicts in 2009, 2015, 2012, and 2014, and so on. As some of you, I'm sure, know, there are been these very periodic episodes, eruptions of violence around Gaza. And then the other half, civilians, right? It's a very, very small number. And this was part of, what Hamas was trying to accomplish, was to shatter that sense of complacency, right? Israelis felt very safe and comfortable, whereas for Palestinians, it was not so much. And so the whole idea, we know this because this is what they said, of Hamas's motivation was really to shatter that sense of safety and comfort. And they did so in a very, very dramatic way. In comparison, over that same period, more than 20 times the number of Palestinians were killed. Most of them civilians, again, mostly in the context of these various episodes of violence in Gaza. But that's 6,400 over 15 years before October 7th, right? And this is important because we often hear talking points like, well, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. There was not a ceasefire on October 6th. There's a ceasefire on October 6th only if you're an Israeli, right? But from the standpoint of Palestinians, there's no ceasefire. There is an occupation. There is a blockade on Gaza. And of course, there's 77 years of dispossession for Palestinian refugees who have been exiled for almost 8 decades. So the idea that Hamas started this did not begin. History did not begin on October 7th. So that's just to sort of put things in perspective. The reality for Palestinians is pretty dramatic. This is by far the deadliest moment in Palestinian history, the largest forced displacement in Palestinian history, including what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the 1948 catastrophe, which entailed the destruction of Palestinian society on which Israel was built, including the destruction of something like 400 villages and 2/3 of the population being expelled. So that catastrophe pales in comparison to the events since October 7th. It is also one of the deadliest and most destructive wars of the century in any context. In the wake of October 7th, Israeli leaders made their intentions very clear. President Herzog declared that there are no innocents in Gaza. Military commanders promised to flatten Gaza, to turn it into a city of tents. Israeli spokespeople, in particular Major Hagari, Daniel Hagari, said that, quote, "The focus is on damage, not precision." Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said he was releasing all restraints and promised that, quote, "Gaza will never go back to what it was." All of which actually came to pass. The Israelis promised to destroy Gaza, and they delivered on that promise. 2 days after the October 7th attack, Defense Minister Gallant declared, quote, "There's no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly." It's impossible to overstate the scale of death and destruction inflicted on Gaza over the last 19 months and the magnitude of human suffering endured by its 2 million inhabitants. More than 100,000 tons of bombs have been dropped on Gaza in the last 19 months. That's equivalent to 7 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima. And more than all of the bombs dropped on Dresden, Hamburg, and London during World War II combined. At least 53,000 people have been killed. That's not including that's 53,000 whose names and ID numbers have been recorded, but that doesn't include roughly 14,000 or so who are buried under the rubble and presumed to be dead as well. So if you do the math, that is basically 1 out of every 38 people in Gaza has been killed. Another 118,000 or so have been injured. Civilians have been killed in record numbers. At least 75% of those killed are civilians. According to Air Wars, which is a nonprofit organization, and I'm quoting, by almost every metric, the harm to civilians from the first month of the Israeli campaign in Gaza is incomparable with any 21st century air campaign. It is by far the most intense, destructive, and fatal conflict for civilians that Air Wars has ever documented. More journalists have been killed in Gaza than in any other conflict, more than 200. More aid workers, around 370. More medical staff, about 1,000, have been killed than in any other conflict, modern conflict. And on top of that, there is evidence that these groups have been deliberately targeted by the Israeli military. So here, for example, this is a tweet by the Israeli Defense Forces, which is essentially a hit list of 6 Palestinian journalists that the Israeli army is openly declaring their intent to murder. And in fact, a number of them, at least one that I know of, has been killed. And again, the Israeli army did not hesitate to take responsibility and to say that this person has been eliminated. It's notable that the Israelis are not claiming that these are armed militants, but they're, quote, propagandists for Hamas and so forth. So this is a whole new level of where people who are, those who are seen as legitimate targets extends to categories that international law and most governments, most rational people would consider civilians. The same goes for, this is hard to talk about, but there are doctors who, American and Canadian and other foreign doctors who went to Gaza and came back and testified that they treated children who were shot by snipers in the head. And I think one of them is quoted as, you don't accidentally shoot someone in the head twice. And then most recently, there was this incident. These are just examples. Of course, there are many such horror stories, but most recently, there was the case of the 15 medics who were killed by Israeli soldiers, and they and their ambulances were buried in a mass grave. The Israelis initially tried to claim that we didn't know who they were advancing suspiciously, and then they changed their story later on to say, oh, it was an error. We've seen the systematic targeting of medics, of aid workers. You remember the World Central Kitchen incident in which not just Palestinian but international aid workers were also targeted. 2,180 families in Gaza in their entirety have been wiped out. We're talking multi-generational families, more than 2,000 parents, children, grandparents, extended family completely wiped out. Whole families removed from the population registry. More than 5,000 families have lost all but one surviving member. In addition, the very institutions that sustain life have been systematically destroyed. 92% of Gaza's housing stock, around 436,000 homes, damaged or destroyed. 88% of the schools damaged or destroyed. All 14 of Gaza's universities completely demolished in controlled demolitions, not because there was a shootout or collateral damage. They were systematically blown up. All 36 of Gaza's hospitals have been bombed. 22 have been ceased to operate. 16 are partially in service. 75% of Gaza's agricultural land has been destroyed. In short, Gaza has been rendered uninhabitable, and I would argue, like many others do, deliberately so. At the same time, Israeli restrictions have led to mass starvation and disease. Dozens of children have died of malnutrition. According to Oxfam, and this was last year, before the current famine, but last year's famine, Gaza was the fastest rate of starvation in recorded history. And of course, starvation is not just man-made in Gaza, it is a function of Israeli policy. From the earliest days of this, whatever we want to call it, a war, a conflict, it is clearly much more than that. But from the earliest days, since October 7th, groups like Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Group, Save the Children, the World Food Program, have all said very clearly that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. UN Secretary General Guterres has, as well as EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, and even agencies of the previous administration, like USAID and the State Department's Refugees Bureau, have come to the same conclusion. This is why experts are calling it a genocide. Experts in genocide and Holocaust studies, such as Raz Sigal of Stockton University and Omer Bartov of Brown University, who incidentally are both Jewish and Israeli, were among the first to call this a genocide. In fact, Raz Sigal wrote a piece within 1 week of the start of the war in which he called it a textbook case of genocide. As a reminder, genocide is not about the number of people who are killed. It is a crime of intent. The Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, ruled that there was a plausible risk of genocide and ordered Israel to take certain steps to stop the genocide, prevent it from happening, and issued 3 sets of provisional measures, all of which have been ignored by both Israel and Western states. The growing consensus among rights and humanitarian aid communities is that this is a genocide. In December, Amnesty International declared that Gaza was a genocide. Later that month, Human Rights Watch came out and said that Israel was committing the crime of extermination and acts of genocide. And the US Special Rapporteur and other UN bodies have all made drawn the same conclusion. And so the question isn't, is this a genocide? But why hasn't anyone intervened to stop it? In addition, despite massive US and Western pressure, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. In the West Bank, there is also terrible things happening, certainly not on the scale of what is taking place in Gaza, but I think indicative of where the current Israeli government is, and as a result, frankly, of being able to act with impunity. In the West Bank, Palestinians are facing unprecedented violence and repression by both the army and Israeli settlers. 870 Palestinians have been killed by army and settlers in the last 19 months. Almost 12,000 have been imprisoned, including around 800 children. In the fall and winter, Israel launched growing offensives in the West Bank, including in January, the largest and most destructive military operation the West Bank has seen since Israel occupied the territory in 1967. Mostly concentrated in the northern part of the West Bank, around Jenin and Tulkarem and Nablus and Tobas, particularly in the refugee camps there. 41,000 people have been displaced from their homes. That's almost the entire Jenin refugee camp has been completely expelled. So in addition to Jenin city, where the Israeli army has destroyed infrastructure, cut power lines, it's a playbook similar to Gaza, but not quite as massive. So how did we get here? I'm going to talk a little bit about the Biden and Trump administrations and my take on how we got to this place. The first thing I would say is, obviously Biden was president when October 7th happened, and there were a lot of things beyond his control. First being the fact that you had two extremist leaderships, Hamas on the one hand, and Netanyahu's ruling coalition. And so they responded they reacted in ways that you might expect. For the Israeli government, the humiliation, the fact that October 7th, that Hamas was able to carry out this attack was deeply humiliating for the leadership, for the military establishment, for a country that prides itself on its military and security prowess. In addition to the trauma felt by Israeli leaders and general public in general. But at the end of the day, what has really sustained this war is Prime Minister Netanyahu. Netanyahu has all throughout had many incentives to continue and expand the war, and very few to end it. His stated goals of total victory are totally unachievable. I think every sane analyst said that from the beginning. I think even Israeli security experts were saying the same thing. So the result is that we've gotten this indefinite, protracted war. For Hamas, the calculations, setting aside the calculations that went into planning and carrying out the October 7th attacks, but just in terms of what Hamas's calculation was afterwards, we know that the leadership inside Gaza was more radical than the leadership outside. For example, those in Doha, compared with Yahya Sinwar and his immediate circle inside Gaza. We also know, because of the history of Israeli-Palestinian conflict and because of the nature of asymmetrical warfare, that for Hamas only needed to survive to quote unquote win, right? So their goal isn't to defeat Israel. That was never on the agenda. It's really at this point to survive, to deny Israel their victory, and that has also helped perpetuate this war, because Israel doesn't have anything that they can hang their hat on. There could be lots of things if they were so inclined, right? But Netanyahu is not interested in ending this war, because the moment he leaves, the war ends, his coalition breaks down, and he will face trial and go to jail. So this is very much about satisfying the extremists in his coalition and keeping himself in power. And yet the Biden administration, as Israel's main ally and benefactor, had enormous leverage that they did not use. In the early months of the conflict, probably until early 2024, the US offered unconditional support for Israel, and in fact explicitly stated that there were no red lines on Israel. which is pretty bold, like something that no previous U.S. administration had ever said. It's one thing to not have red lines, it's another thing to say you have no red lines publicly, and then Israel takes that as a license to commit all kinds of atrocities, which they did. As the war dragged on into the spring and middle part of last year, the administration became more and more frustrated with the Israeli leadership and the offensive, which even Biden himself described as over the top and indiscriminate. By spring 2024, the administration began pushing for a limited ceasefire. The U.S. became more critical of Israeli actions, but without any consequences or follow-through. Why is this? Why was this so? It's not because Biden didn't approve of Israeli conduct, but there were moments where he was critical and even threatened the Israelis. And the problem here is what many refer to as the bear hug. Biden's philosophy, which previous U.S. administrations, there's pretty standard policy, but Biden kind of took it to an extreme, and that is the way to influence Israel's decision-making isn't to put conditions or make threats or to play hardball, right? It's to show them unconditional love, to hug them, to bear hug them. And sort of you could visualize it, right? The idea is that you hug them so hard that you're constraining them. That's the theory, right? But the problem with the bear hug is that it's never worked. When you give Israel unconditional love, it takes that as permission to continue doing what it wants to do. And that's precisely what happened. So time and again, we saw the U.S. issue an ultimatum only to back down later on. The April 4th airstrike on the World Central Kitchen, if you remember, Tony Blinken issued a very stark threat to the Israelis. Either Israel changes its behavior across the board, allow more humanitarian aid, stop targeting medics, all of these things. Unless Israel changes its behavior, the U.S. will change its policy. Israel did not change its behavior, and U.S. policy continued as unconditional as it was. You all may remember the Rafah red line, when President Biden said, Israel, you've destroyed Gaza City, you've destroyed Khan Yunis in the center of Gaza, you've driven the population to the south, they have nowhere else to go. Rafah is their only refuge. It's a red line. If the Israeli army goes into Gaza, that's it. Aside from the withholding of one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, the weapons flowed. After the Israeli army, Netanyahu, of course, called Biden's bluff, went into Rafah, destroyed most of it, and the Biden administration simply said, it's not really an invasion, it's kind of don't believe your lying eyes. It was just it was an uptick in military activity. 40% of Rafah was destroyed. And then, of course, there was the last ultimatum, one of the last acts of the administration before leaving office in September of last year, when the Secretary Blinken and Defense Secretary Austin issued a joint ultimatum to the Israelis and said, here's a long list of things that Israel is doing wrong that we want you to change and that you must do or else there will be consequences. So they included things like you have to increase the number of aid trucks to 350 a day. You have to allow UNRWA, unfettered access. UNRWA is the UN agency that supports Palestine refugees, and that is the backbone of the entire humanitarian effort in Gaza. You have to allow UNRWA to operate freely. And what did Israel do? The number of trucks went down. UNRWA was banned. Israel passed legislation banning UNRWA entirely. A coalition of humanitarian organizations issued a joint statement. Israel was given 30 days to make these following improvements or else. And, a coalition of humanitarian groups came together, issued a statement saying not only did Israel not meet the criteria set by the United States, but the actions it took actually made the situation dramatically worse. How did the administration respond? Once again, don't believe your lying eyes or your lying ears, issued Israel a clean bill of health and continued business as usual. Now, that's the Biden administration. The Trump administration is a different story in a lot of respects. First, we had the ceasefire deal that Trump took credit for. And he campaigned even as, I'm going to bring an end to these wars. I'm going to end the wars in Ukraine and end the war in Gaza and so forth. And then came this ceasefire deal the day before he took office. The ceasefire deal, as you might remember, had 3 phases that allowed for the gradual release of hostages in return for a surge in humanitarian aid, a release of Palestinian prisoners, and eventually an end to the war and reconstruction in phase 2 and 3 of this ceasefire deal. But almost immediately after the ceasefire deal, Trump began to send signals that he was perfectly fine with Netanyahu if he wanted to keep the ceasefire deal or abandon it. It was fine with him. Unlike Biden, Trump policy made no pretense about caring for things like human rights or international law. And instead, they openly embraced some of the most extreme policies of the Israeli government. In February, you might remember, Trump shocked the world when he called for cleaning out the Gaza Strip of its population in order to rebuild it as a Riviera, basically a plan for ethnically cleansing Gaza. And his administration has explicitly supported the total blockade on aid. And then when Israel opted to unilaterally cancel the ceasefire, the U.S. again embraced it. On March 2nd, Israel imposed a total blockade, preventing all food, medicine, water from entering Gaza. Nothing has entered Gaza for the last 64 or 5 days. Since then, again, with the blessing of the United States and with, frankly, the shocking silence of most of the international community. Today, there's a piece in the Financial Times, their official editorial. I forget the title, but it's about that Gaza is a moral stain or something on the world, and I believe that this is a conservative newspaper, by the way. On March 18th, Israel resumed its bombing. In the first 24 hours of its bombing, it killed 436 people in a single day. One of the deadliest days since the war began, that including 180 children. The next day, the Israeli army relaunched the ground offensive and took large swaths of territory that it had redeployed from during phase 1 of the ceasefire. And Defense Minister Israel Katz warned the Gaza population to get rid of Hamas or face, quote, destruction and total devastation. Again, Israelis aren't shy about their intentions. It's only Americans who sort of launder the words, American politicians who launder the words of Israeli officials. Israeli officials have been very straightforward and honest about their intentions from the beginning. And we should believe them because everything they've done is consistent with that. And then just a couple of days ago, the Israeli cabinet approved a plan for the conquest of Gaza, in which the remaining population in the north would be entirely moved to the south. Israel would assume full control over aid distribution, with U.S. contractors acting as the distributors of the aid. And we can only assume that, and of course that whatever hasn't been destroyed would be destroyed. This is what the Israeli cabinet is now threatening to carry out in Gaza. We can only assume that, one, they need it, and that this is in furtherance of the plan to, relocate the population outside of Gaza. The humanitarian conditions in Gaza are the most catastrophic they have been in the last 19 months. Just since Israel broke the ceasefire, 2,300 people have been killed. 57 children have died of malnutrition. So this is on the day after phase 1 of the ceasefire was completed, and then this is a month later. Israel controls, all of the orange areas are no-go zones for Palestinians. They'll be pushed into ever smaller areas. So Gaza was already a very densely populated place. And so now around 70% of Gaza will be off limits, and they'll be squeezed into this tiny, it's completely unsustainable. But again, the goal, we can only assume, is to make it so miserable that people will leave. 57 children have died. So this is what Gaza looks like currently. 57 children have died of malnutrition. 3,500 are facing imminent death by starvation, and another 290,000 children are on the brink of death, according to local authorities. So, again, I'm just going to wrap up now. Netanyahu's stated aims of destroying Gaza are not achievable. This war will only end when outside actors, namely powerful countries like the United States or European countries, force Netanyahu to end the war. Secondly, the Gaza catastrophe will reverberate in the region and around the world for decades. Obviously, for Palestinians, the human and material costs are immeasurable. The massive generational trauma will reshape Palestinian politics in ways that we can't even predict, and will almost certainly sow the seeds for conflict for decades to come. In the meantime, it would be foolish to imagine that there will not be some kind of blowback for Israel as well. The idea that Israeli safety and security can come entirely at the expense of Palestinians is illusory, and I think that's just human nature, but also we have plenty of Palestinian-Israeli history to back that up. The US is also paying a price. Reputationally, American credibility has been shot, not just in the Arab and Muslim world, but across the global South, and frankly, even in the West. Not many people know this, but a number of European countries like Ireland and Spain have joined South Africa's genocide case as, it's a sort of the equivalent of an amicus brief, right? They've joined in accusing Israel of genocide. That will have very long-term implications, not just for Spanish or Irish relations with Israel, but with the United States as well. The whole idea of an international rules-based order, I think, has been completely eviscerated. If all of this is acceptable, if it's within the confines of law, as Israel claims that everything they're doing is lawful, if it is lawful to completely destroy a society, and everything that sustains it, to block all aid from entering, to kill with impunity, if those things are lawful, well, then the law means nothing. I mean, it's completely meaningless. This is precisely the kind of situation that the Geneva Conventions and the whole post-World War II multilateral rules-based order was designed to prevent, not be complicit in. This should be obvious, but I'm going to state it because it's relevant to my book and I think it needs to be said. The idea of a US-led peace process is a thing of the past, okay? There is no government, not even a future democratic administration, that will lead a peace process between Israelis and Palestinians. I believed this before October 7th, and I'm absolutely convinced of it today. The only way that will change is if the special relationship between the United States and Israel ends or is severely curtailed in some way. I don't see that happening in the near future. Lastly, if we're going to talk about any kind of future peace process or reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, which I think is necessary and is doable, it will have to include some form of accountability, some mechanism of accountability for the current atrocities. If it's not the ICJ or the ICC, then some other mechanism has to be built into it, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something. But the idea of just bringing Israelis and Palestinians to around a table and saying, talk, without addressing these atrocities or the vast power asymmetry between them, I'm sorry, is just a recipe for consistent failure. And there is no Palestinian leadership that would ever go along with that sort of thing. And I apologize if I went over time, but look forward to the discussion with you all.
All right, you can all hear? Okay, great. Khaled, that was a very comprehensive review of a complex issue. And I don't think anyone, yes, it's hard to get that into 30 minutes as well. Let me just handle a little admin here. First of all, before we get into it, I just want to say any comments expressed by me are purely my own ideas. They do not reflect the policies of the Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army, or the U.S. government. And the second admin point here, just to, as far as the cards go, who's going to collect the cards? Okay. So if you haven't written your question, please, I just ask as a courtesy to me, please write legibly so I can read it. Yeah, and then we'll take care of your cards. Okay. So, okay, it's been a slow news cycle in Gaza until very recently, right? It seemed that there was a ceasefire until March, and then it seemed that there was a trickle of hostages, and there's been a lot of talk about domestic politics in Israel, but nothing is really moving on the ground. And so just within the last couple of days, a couple of things, right? So it was announced that a truce, the airstrikes, the U.S. airstrikes are going to stop targeting the Houthis in their alliance with, their solidarity with Hamas. They're going to stop targeting U.S. ships there, but that doesn't it also leaves out the U.S. having any say in the striking Israel. So that's an interesting thing. In addition, there are some other changes as well. Let's see. We talked about we mentioned about the aid coming into Gaza. There's some news on that today as well, and then I'd like to ask a question about that. And despite the conflict as it stands today, and the complexities that you outlined, how would you characterize this conflict in the overall Arab-Israeli conflict? As you talked about, from Zionism to the Balfour Declaration to the State of Israel, and then the Nakba, and then the successive wars, and then into Camp David, the plan for peace, the peace process, and that really ends with President Clinton in 2000 with some false starts along the way. Is this current conflict in Gaza, would you consider this to be the next step in that struggle, or is this something different? Is this something that is really a different texture?
It's a good question, and I would start by saying the word conflict is inadequate to describe what's happening. I do think it is a conflict, but it's so much more than that. Conflict can arise out of many things. It is a highly asymmetrical conflict, first and foremost. It is a conflict, when the Algerians fought the French to gain their independence, it was a conflict, but it was also an anti-colonial struggle, and there were a million Algerians who were killed in the course. There were atrocities committed. So conflict is a very inadequate term, but it's not totally inapplicable. That said, I do think that the conflict aspect of this has undergone a number of shifts, right? It's evolved. It's not the same. So during the British Mandate, there was a conflict in Palestine between the Zionist movement and the Palestinian majority, and the British. There was conflict in some ways between all three. It's after 1948 and Israel's establishment, became a very different conflict, because now you had 2/3 of the population was expelled. You have Palestinians now in refugee camps, so the conflict enters a new phase. 1967, it enters yet another phase, because now Israel is controlling not just the 78% of Palestine that became Israel, but also the rest of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And I think this is the next phase. Whether Gaza's population is removed or not, what comes next is very hard to know. I do think this is qualitatively and quantitatively different than any previous moment, and we cannot, the notion that someone like Mahmoud Abbas or Democrats in Washington and some in the analyst community in Washington, if they imagine that, well, if we can stabilize this, if we can get a ceasefire, and we can get humanitarian aid in, and we can get reconstruction for Gaza, and we can go back to a peace process and bring, we'll have a peace conference, and maybe the Arab states will do this, that, or the other thing. That's all fantasy. This is a whole new game. There is no, Mahmoud Abbas is a spent force. He is not a Palestinian leader who is representative, who has legitimacy. I'm not Palestinian, but I'm a political scientist, and I have lived in Palestine, and I have studied this, and I can say definitively, he does not have the legitimacy. He didn't have the legitimacy when I was there advising leadership in 2008. That was the impetus of my book. Was we were briefing President Abbas. Actually, we were getting briefed by Saad Barakat, the chief negotiator, about what was going to become the Annapolis negotiations, and I asked him. I said, "But they're gonna go into negotiations. Does Abu Mazen even have the legitimacy to go? Does he have a mandate to negotiate anything? He just lost Gaza a few months ago, and he just lost an election the year before. That was when he was at the peak of his power and legitimacy. Now, his approval ratings are in the low single digits. So there will be a new Palestinian leadership. And it's not Mahmoud Abbas, and it's not Hussein al-Sheikh or whoever his handpicked successor will be. We don't know what Palestinian politics will look like in 5, 10, or 15 years. There will be a kind of incubation period. So none of the actors, maybe even not Hamas, that exist now are going to be relevant if and when a future diplomatic process emerges. No, I've lost the trail of your question. I've answered something else. But
Continuation of the old conflict, or is this a new conflict?
This is a new conflict. This is a new phase of the conflict, because we've now added a whole new layer, right? there was Balfour, and then there was 1948 and the Nakba. That's a new layer of conflict, and the expulsion of Palestinians. And in 1967, now you've added a new layer. And then, you could argue there have been smaller layers, right? Sabra and Shatila in 1982, and there was the second Intifada. So there's all these layers that get piled on, and this is a whole new layer that's been added, and I think one that will project this conflict into the future for generations. There's just no way around that. How do you tell people in Gaza whether they're allowed to remain? I mean, just try to imagine what life is like in Gaza right now. It's aid workers will say, we've run out of adjectives. They were calling it hellish 6 months ago. Well, if it was hellish 6 months ago, and it was catastrophic 9 months ago, what is it now? There's just no more words to describe people who are literally being starved, bombed, burned, and cut off from the whole world. The level of trauma, if where every single family in Gaza has lost family members, their home, they've lost everything. And the Israeli mindset is that the way you resolve conflicts is you pound people into submission. It has never ever worked. It goes against the fabric of human nature. But this is their philosophy, right? It's that if we just hit them hard enough, they'll stop. That's the whole logic of Israeli deterrent, is we have to hit you to the point where you feel deterred because the cost will be too great for you. And that will work. Repression works for a period of time until it doesn't work anymore. And at a certain point, people will find ways to hurt Israelis, just like Hamas did. And I absolutely believe that what Israel is doing is creating, the one thing that sustains the conflict more than anything else, I think, is trauma, right? It's this trauma of I feel so aggrieved, and I feel I have to make you pay a price for it. And that is even former Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told the Israelis in December 2023, if you don't change your behavior, if you don't do more to protect civilians, as if they were doing anything really to protect civilians, but if you don't do more, then Israel is trading, forget how he put it, Israel is trading its tactical successes for strategic failure, okay? It's common knowledge, you know this in the military, that the way you conduct war can either inflame the situation, or it can make things less terrible. And everything Israel has done says there's just going to be more conflict.
So that is definitely, as we look at Israel, they've laid out the case for Netanyahu, who this week has said that the number one goal right now, his number one goal in his strategy, is to win in Gaza. And then the number two thing is to return the hostages. And it is widely believed domestically in Israel that it's more for the first and not so much for the second. But as we look at that, and regardless of culpability on either side, we look at that conflict in Gaza, as we go across Israel and we look at the West Bank, and where is Mahmoud Abbas, where is Abu Mazen in this conflict? If it seems that these two conflicts are diverging on their own strategic outcomes, because even if there were peace in Gaza, there's still a settlement expansion problem in the West Bank, and it seems that now these conflicts are taking on a life of their own. Now, you've mentioned this about Lloyd Austin, talking about Biden, and Netanyahu has received these deadlines before, and many times the United States gets a lot of criticism for essentially doing either what Israel wants or that the United States winds up supporting Israel. But it seems that despite the warnings by the United States, Netanyahu does whatever he wants without penalty. So it seems like we don't have the ability as the United States to curb Netanyahu's enthusiasm, right? So, like, really, the question to ask is, if we were to get to the peace table in either side of this, who speaks for the Palestinians? Where does it go from here?
Yeah.
And ultimately, if Palestine is still an open question, what do you want it to be?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think the U.S. Does have leverage with Israel, but it chooses to not use it, and so it becomes self-fulfilling. It's like, oh well, we could never, Biden's thing was we could never cut Israel's military aid. We could withhold a shipment here, we could do this there, we could do it in sort of tactical ways, but the idea of using our $4 billion of unconditional aid and any aspect of the special relationship as leverage is automatically thrown out the window. So it's a self-imposed constraint. It's not that they can't do it, it's that they won't do it. And we could say that, well, the politics won't allow it. I think the politics have changed. Politics on the Democratic side have certainly changed. The grassroots, a majority of Americans say their military aid should be conditioned. Okay? Not that a majority of Americans matter when it comes to policy making, but if you were a politician and you wanted the political cover, you could say, well, my constituents are telling me that we should condition aid, that we should leverage that. Poll after poll after poll says that, and it's especially strong on the left and among Democrats. So that's a choice. That's one thing. As far as who speaks for Palestinians, those of you familiar with Palestinian history, you know who Hajj Amin al-Husseini was. He was the Palestinian leader before Israel's creation during the British Mandate, and he was widely respected among, he was sort of revered as the leader. After 1948, after the Nakba, the Mufti Hajj Amin al-Husseini was not relevant anymore. They tried to set up a government in Gaza, ironically called the All-Palestine Government. It was backed by the Egyptians, and its seat was in Gaza City, and project some kind of Palestinian leadership. But it was too little, too late. He was already swept aside by history. Abu Mazen is the Mufti of today. Okay, he's in his position, and the Mufti, by the way, claimed to be the true leader of the Palestinians until his death in 1974. Right? Even when Yasser Arafat was heading the PLO and was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, recognized as such by the Arab League and others. And so Abu Mazen will, to his dying breath, insist, I am the leader of the Palestinian people, but he doesn't have any legitimacy. He is not relevant. He's barely relevant in the West Bank. He's certainly not relevant in Gaza. He's not relevant on the diplomatic scene. So right now there isn't, the kind of diplomacy that we're talking about is how to end this horror in Gaza, how to ensure aid, how to rebuild Gaza. You can have Palestinian interlocutors for that. But there's no possibility of having a diplomatic process to talk about a two-state solution or a confederation or even a one-state solution.
Do you believe in the two-state solution?
I worked for a two-state solution. I no longer believe that a two-state solution is achievable. Not because of Palestinians, but because successive Israeli governments have said absolutely never, and we now have one of the two parties in the United States has officially done away with the two-state solution as well. So if the Israelis don't want it and the Americans don't want it, then it doesn't matter what Palestinians want.
So perhaps an incremental approach based on individual problems rather than a comprehensive peace plan And so with that, I will say that what you're saying, when the U.S. was brought into the peace talks as an honest broker and perhaps has lost legitimacy in recent years, if not the United States, then who?
Yeah, but we're not talking about a peace plan, and I'm not talking about a peace process. Just those are concepts that, it's like talking to our kids about Windows 95. Okay, it just doesn't mean anything. Okay, there's no peace process. That's a thing of the past. Okay, the only things that we can talk about now, maybe an international protection force, maybe accountability in the ICC or the ICJ or some other mechanism. We can talk about a multinational force, the stabilization force. We can talk about humanitarian aid. All of these things will need to be negotiated and will need lots of stakeholders to come around the table and agree and implement these things. But the idea of a peace process, that's just not a relevant concept at all on any level. It's just words.
Yeah. So it is, and people have long memories there as well. And so, all right, I would say there's a lot of audience participation.
I see that.
And
there's more cards there than people.
I think the post office is just delivering cards. Yeah. So, all right. So let's get into some of the audience questions here. So this question has to do with humanitarian aid. Now, in the news was just reported about a plan to implement an American contractor to distribute aid in using facial recognition to identify family members to distribute the aid. Now, this has up to now been a real problem. And even though the IDF does not distribute aid, they say they've opened gates to allow the aid to come in. The question here is, though, could Egypt have provided access to Gaza for humanitarian aid to help open up more ways for aid to come in? And if so, how could Egypt have helped?
I mean, the Egyptians probably, to take the second question first, the Egyptians probably could do more. But at the moment, there are thousands of trucks lined up on the Egyptian side of the border trying to get in. And if the Israelis are on the other side saying, you can't come in. So unless Egypt is prepared to send in tanks to escort these aid trucks and maybe some air cover, I don't expect the Egyptians are going to do that. So Israel is calling the shots. Israel is not allowing aid. The reality is that there are mechanisms already for delivering aid. But they're mechanisms that Israel is at war with in the same way it's at war with everything in Gaza. So it's not a secret, I'm not using a microphone, but it's not a secret that Israel hates UNRWA. Okay, UNRWA, the UN agency, and it's not because UNRWA, you remember the dossier last year, the Israelis had a dossier, Hamas, they support, UNRWA is implicated in the October 7th attack. All bullshit, I'm sorry. It all turned out to be complete bullshit, but not before the United States and every other UN, UNRWA donor had cut off the funds. So even without any evidence, they all went bam, instantaneous. The US never resumed its funding of UNRWA, but all other donors did, including Germany and other very strongly pro-Israel countries who said, look, we gave you the benefit of the doubt, but you didn't present anything resembling evidence, so we had to resume. So why does Israel hate UNRWA so much? Because UNRWA represents the Nakba. UNRWA represents Palestinian refugees and their claims and their identity as Palestinian refugees. It is a constant reminder that Israel was born in sin, okay? Israelis don't want to be reminded that they drove these people out, right? They put Palestinian in quotes and refugees in quotes. And so that is the war against UNRWA. It is because they want to erase the concept of Palestinian refugees, that these people have no claim to land, to a history, to anything. And which is ironic, right? Because the whole law of return in Israel is based on Jews can return to their homeland after 2,000 years but Palestinians cannot return after 77 years. So it's and even though this is a standard part of international refugee law, the Palestinians are not the only people in the world who pass their refugee status on to their children and grandchildren. That's true of all refugees. You don't think a child born in a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan has a claim to be a Syrian citizen? Of course he does. He has a claim the same way. If he grows up in that refugee camp, he still has the right to return. So UNRWA is already the backbone of the humanitarian aid effort. Israel wants to weaponize humanitarian aid to be able to push its agenda. And it's not as if these institutions aren't functioning. It's that Israel won't allow them to function. And instead of the United States and the world saying, no, what you're proposing is not workable. It's not only not workable, it's cruel. It's cruel. They're talking about 60 trucks a day of food for 2.3 million people. 60 trucks. That's at the height of this really dystopian, this plan. And so, all of the aid groups that work in Gaza have unanimously said this is completely unworkable. It's not consistent with the principles of international law and humanitarian assistance. This is completely, the idea that aid will be conditional on political subservience or whatever conditions, facial recognition. You have to prove that you're not Hamas and that you're not harboring Hamas and that you were never worked for Hamas. But what about the thousands of civil servants who work in Hamas ministries? Do they not get food? Their families don't deserve to eat? And people who fixed roads or worked in the Ministry of Education. I mean, it's...
Hamas is right now the rightful, the legitimate government in Gaza. Why doesn't the aid just go to Hamas and they're responsible for distributing it?
Well, because almost everyone agrees that shouldn't happen. And even Hamas has said, we will give up our governing role, but we're not going to surrender and we're not going to give up our arms, but we will happily, and they even made an agreement with the folks in Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority, that there will be a joint Palestinian committee that will be, and so all of this has been agreed. It's just there isn't political will to implement it. But the plan that Israel has put forward is completely unworkable.
Yeah, and it does seem, as we sort of look at this, you're starting to tease this out. When you go back to the end of phase 1 of the ceasefire, we could never get to phase 2 because of this issue about laying down arms. Laying down arms, even to just put it temporarily down.
That wasn't in the ceasefire deal. The laying down weapons was not.
But getting past phase 2, because nobody really even knows what phase 3 looks like, honestly, because we could never get into phase 2.
But nobody knows what phase 2 looks like either, because the details weren't worked out. Yes. But there was a framework, and that was agreed to, that Netanyahu signed.
I agree, and certainly with Netanyahu's position, they sought an extension of phase 1 rather than implementing phase 2. And it was contentious. So let me just move on. Yeah. In your book, Blind Spot, you wrote about the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to reach a two-state solution, largely because there were irreducible factors of Israeli power and Palestinian politics. It's a blind spot. What's the blind spot to find a solution?
It's the first edition of the book, I talk about the blind spot in terms of, just to explain for those who aren't familiar with the book, the whole idea of the blind spot is that, it's not a secret, American politicians and policymakers look at the issue through a very Israeli lens. And so if you look at the issue through an Israeli lens, certain things get filtered out. And what gets filtered out chronically is Palestinian politics, right? The fact that they have politics is not something that Americans think about or care about. And Israeli power, right? The fact that there's this power asymmetry. And so that is how I saw the blind spot being manifested, is well, where Americans say, well, just bring Israelis and Palestinians sit across from each other at the peace table and they'll make peace, ignoring the fact that one is subordinate to the other, right? I mean, it's common sense. And so for all these really smart geopolitical minds in Washington to overlook this basic fact of power asymmetry, that Palestinians are not a sovereign state negotiating with a neighboring state. They're an occupied population where if the Israelis wanted to kill Abu Mazen or arrest him, they would, right? They arrest Palestinian parliamentarians. They hold up their ministers at checkpoints. They can do whatever they want, right? A 19-year-old soldier has more say in the Palestinian economy than the Minister of Finance, because he can control the movement of people and goods through a single checkpoint. So that was how I envisioned the blind spot then. Now, it's a much bigger blind spot than I ever imagined, that extends to not only Palestinian rights and politics and Israeli power, but to Palestinian humanity. There's an inability of whether we're talking about Biden or Trump, or many in Congress, to see Palestinians as human beings. Something that I didn't anticipate before October 7th. The extent to which you have people enthusiastically supporting the total denial of an entire population of basic food and medicine. How anyone could justify this, whatever the atrocities committed by Hamas, whatever, there's no justification for starving children. There just isn't, right? There just isn't. And the fact that so many people, too many people, cannot see that, because they can't see Palestinians as human. And it's a much more severe blind spot than I even anticipated.
Okay, so that's, all right. So we're talking about power structures, right? So as we look at that, you could say that Hamas is a rational actor in that they won't lay down their arms, they won't surrender and disarm because of what they consider to be the pressure of the Israeli government to wipe them out, right? So the next, you mentioned in your comments about an outside coalition, whether that's a coalition of Arab states or that's an international coalition or UN-led. The question for the audience is, outside actors can only force Israel to end the war. Who are these outside actors that could come in and aid Palestine? Assuming that the politics would allow it, who would do that?
I know this is going to sound crazy, but Israelis have a responsibility. Israel destroyed Gaza. They have a responsibility to pay for rebuilding Gaza. And it's just common sense. It's just basic. Of course they won't. But you can't, this notion of Israel can do whatever it wants and other people pay the price. Palestinians pay the price in human terms, and the region and the Gulf states, or Europeans and the Japanese, the Canadians pay the price in financial terms to rebuild Gaza and for the reconstruction of Gaza. That seems like the most likely way out, but it's patently unfair and stupid, right? Because, and this is why those states, the Arab states, the Europeans in particular, who are going to foot the bill for rebuilding Gaza, should have been doing more to prevent Gaza's destruction in the first place, if not out of a sense of humanity, then at least out of a sense of self-interest. Well, what I don't do now, I'm going to pay for later. Even if Gaza's, the population is expelled, well, someone has to house them. They have to have services wherever they go. And so I think it will have to be a consortium of stakeholders in the region The Gulf states are an obvious address because they have resources. Countries like Egypt and Jordan, because they're adjacent to Palestine, they have a direct stake in stability in Palestine. The Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, whoever has a stake in stability there, I think there's a lot to choose from. It's not an insurmountable thing, but it will take political will.
You make it sound like the Riviera plan isn't going to work.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, it's not going to work. Honestly, it's just so bizarre. It's like, who are you building this for? It's obviously not for the population. I mean, I think even, you know, it was almost comical to watch spokespeople for the White House try to make sense of what the president said in February when he first said it. And they're like, oh, well, he didn't mean that they can't come back. And then he comes and says, well, yeah, no, I didn't mean they can't come. They're not coming back. Because, you know, first they thought, well, he's going to rebuild Gaza, they're going to move them temporarily, and then they'll be allowed back when it's all nice and pretty. But that's not what he meant. And he said, no, they're going to be gone forever. They will live somewhere else. Egypt, Jordan, Malaysia, I don't care. And then we're going to build, you know, Riviera, the golf courses and fun stuff for him, apparently, and his friends. So it's just so bizarre. But all of these problems are solvable with enough political will. Gaza could be rebuilt. There is an Egyptian plan that was endorsed by the Arab League. It is ambitious, and it's not perfect, but it's something to work with, right? And politics is all about the possible. If people wanted Gaza to be rebuilt, it could be rebuilt. If people wanted to end this war, the war would end. But not enough people want it bad enough to make those things happen.
Okay, let's harness that idea about the people on the ground. So briefly, let's talk about domestic politics in Israel. Let's talk about.
Some of the questions.
Yeah, that's what I'm going through these questions. Yeah. So in domestic politics, so on on October 6th of 23, there were problems in Israel with Netanyahu's government. There were problems with the Supreme Court. There were problems with the military as well. And so, and now as we go on, there are still those problems and the cracks show. So considering Israeli history, how come the population of Israel doesn't rebel against this? If it's considered a genocide, then why don't they step up? Why don't Israeli citizens push back? Are they on board with this? Are they scared? What's the scene on the ground?
So, in terms of, yes, there was an opposition to Netanyahu. There were protests against Netanyahu for many, many months before October 7th. They were very large protests because of, his plans to overhaul the judiciary and basically, cobble whatever democratic institutions existed in Israel, and really taking it down an authoritarian path. So areas that had nothing to do with Palestinians, there was this opposition. But this government, the Netanyahu government, the Netanyahu-Smotrich Ben Gvir government, is both the most extreme government in Israel's history and the most stable. So this is the problem, right? Any potential rival to Netanyahu, whether it's Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid, they've all failed. And they've all gotten played by him. So there is no. And the reality is, the polls that I've seen, if there were elections held today, they would be inconclusive, which means the Netanyahu government would continue as a caretaker government indefinitely. And so there isn't a viable electoral bloc that can unseat Netanyahu. That's just the reality of Israeli politics. There is opposition in addition to his authoritarian measures. There's growing opposition with regard to the hostages, right? Growing dissent. People are fed up. Israeli public and pundits know what seemingly most members of Congress don't, and that is the single biggest obstacle to the hostages being released is Netanyahu himself and his coalition partners, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who frankly would rather have the hostages die, because what's 54 Israelis when they could have all of Gaza and expel the population? It's a much bigger prize. And for Netanyahu, it's all about his political survival. He's not going to commit political suicide and risk going to jail for 54 Israelis. He's just not going to do it. So there is opposition, but it's not at a critical mass where it can unseat him, either on his domestic measures or on the hostages. One interesting thing, though, that we've seen is there is a growing segment of Israeli society, despite the severe repression and kind of social stigma against doing so, who are openly calling it a genocide and saying, stop killing children. And there are Israelis brave enough to say that. Some of them are, in the media. It's a very small number, but it's growing. And maybe there's some hope in that.
So let's ask this question real quick then. If as we look at the dysfunction of the Netanyahu government, or the ineptitude in some cases, is there a possibility that this government allowed October 7th to happen? Just to go back in recent history, mowing the grass was the Netanyahu policy to allow things to happen in Gaza, and then the IDF would go in and mow it down and things would be quiet for a while. Do you think that Netanyahu was complacent and allowed October 7th to happen?
I definitely think he and the entire security establishment was complacent. Mm-hmm. And we now have reports from the mid-level intelligence people who did sound the alarm that, oh wait, it does look like Hamas is planning something big. And then those messages, as they got sent up, were sort of ignored. And, at the end of the day, intelligence is only as good as the humans who are interpreting it. And so if they decide, well, for whatever reason, Hamas is too, they could never plan something so big. And, this is the most heavily surveilled area on Earth. They've got drones in the air. They've got everybody's cell phones. They've got everything that's electronically and digitally compromised. Nothing could go, right? But they didn't expect anything of this scale. And so they were caught with their pants down. And I think that's part of the rage that the security establishment felt, and that sense of humiliation, and then why they responded in these outrageous ways.
Yeah, humiliation will come up again and again and again.
And again.
Okay, Khaled, are you ready?
Yes.
We're going to do the lightning round. Get through a bunch of these questions. Lightning round, big money. Big money. Okay. All right. What could American media do better to cover this? How can Americans help Palestinians without being considered aiding terrorists or anti-Semitic or anything like that?
What could the American media do better? Oh my God.
In 13 words or less.
Yeah, anyone who, look, as an Arab American who is not Palestinian but Palestinian adjacent, because my wife's Palestinian, I lived in Palestine, my kids were born there, and there was the trauma of October 7th and the trauma of Israel's response to October 7th, and then the trauma of having to witness American and Western media coverage of all of this horror. It was atrocious. I have never seen, I lived through 9/11 and its aftermath. I've never seen a more reckless, irresponsible, and I'm generalizing, the media coverage was so reckless. They ran with stories that were completely fabricated. 40 beheaded babies, the babies in ovens, all of this. All of the standards of journalism went right out the window. And that in of itself, having to witness that, and that we know that a Palestinian 8-year-old boy was murdered in Chicago over this kind of hysterical media coverage. And so the media did get better, but I can remember the first several weeks when protests started happening on campus, and then I would be asked, this was like CNN or BBC or one of these, and I was asked, well, what do you think about these pro-Hamas demonstrations on college campuses? And I'm like, what are you talking about, pro-Hamas? They're not they're not supporting Hamas. They're in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So just the coverage was atrocious, and it's gotten marginally better, but over a very long learning curve. Very long answer. And the second part is, what can Americans do? Write your members of Congress. Tell them it's not okay to underwrite atrocities like starving children deliberately. It's write your letters to the editor. Talk to your neighbors. Put up signs in your yard. I don't know. I'm not in advocacy, but I'm sure there's a lot that can be done on the humanitarian front as well.
It's almost like there's a messaging problem. I mean, there is a very large pro-Israeli group, which is AIPAC, 5 million members strong. So that's a lobbying group, and it seems like the Palestinians need a strong lobbying group in America as well, and that's difficult. Okay, here's a twofer. Here it comes. Now, how are we going to find peace when Israelis commit to destroying Gaza or Hamas commits to destroying Israel? And then, is this conflict for Hamas a religious war?
It's a good question. The one thing that worries me is the kind of religionification of this conflict, because once you introduce God and religion, and then it's like, well, then it's beyond diplomacy and beyond politics, and you can't negotiate with God, right? God wants this or that. Well, you want me to do? Speaking of which, Mike Huckabee he's the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Israel, and he went out to a settlement today and was saying anyone who doesn't stand with Israel is standing against God. So it's not a question of Hamas anymore. Yeah, Hamas is an Islamist nationalist movement, but I still believe that Hamas is more nationalist than it is Islamist. And their goals are nationalist. They're not trying to wage jihad for Muslims in Kashmir or Myanmar or Kosovo, right? They're focused on Palestine, but with an Islamic, tint to it. Israeli politics is becoming very, very religious and extreme, and very uncomfortable for secular Israelis. The religious right in Israel is already in control of many of the social aspects of life, but is also now dominating the political sphere. So yes, the religionizing this conflict is dangerous on all sides, including the American, maybe even more so, because these are people who believe that Armageddon has to happen in the Holy Land in order for the Messiah to come back, and they are in positions of power, and they are very close to the nuclear trigger, right? So I worry more about someone like Mike Huckabee and Pete Hegseth, who's also a fundamentalist, than I do about Hamas. Because at the end of the day, Hamas is this, and the United States is,
Khaled, congratulations. You've survived the lightning round, and I award you 10,000 points.
Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get to every question, but I managed to aggregate as many questions as I could, so I'd like to say we've had a very lively response from the audience to your comments, and we got to as many questions as we could, but thank you for providing context and depth in your answers. And thank you, audience, for all of your questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled, and thank you, Frank, so much for your time and energy tonight. And thank you all for taking the time out of your evening to engage with this incredibly important topic. And I hope you stay engaged. I hope you keep up with Khaled's work. And I hope that we see you at a future IRC program. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Also, I would be remiss to not also remind you that there are many groups on the ground organizing here in Kansas City, both advocacy and humanitarian. We have the chairman of the Palestinian American Medical Association right here in this room. We have Al-Hadaf, an organizing group. We have Citizens for Justice in the Middle East. There are plenty of ways to get engaged, to know what to do, to know how to take the information that you learned here tonight from scholars and experts, as well as from community members and neighbors, and to use that to not only push American empire away from destruction, but also to revive our democracy here in the United States.